Hey, this is Julio.
Hey, this is Steve.
Before the podcast starts, we want to welcome and give you the opportunity to support our ministry by visiting our website at www.bridgemanlaredo.org. Scroll down to the bottom of any page and you'll find the PayPal donate button.
Bridge Ministries exists to share the glorious good news of Jesus Christ and to equip people to be transformed by the renewing of their minds. If you would like to help us in our mission of making affordable or free Bibles and Christian books available, and also to check out the orphanage that we support, visit our website.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, thank you so much for tuning in to Coffee Colloquy, brought to you by Bridge Ministries. We are a Christian bookstore and coffee shop, and yeah, thank you for tuning in to Coffee Colloquy. This is the podcast where theology nerds and geeks gather around to talk about philosophy and theology and soteriology, and today's going to be a little bit different. We're going to be on the topic of apologetics. But before we get to that, my name is Julio Rodriguez. You could call me July. And to the right of me, I have my brother in Christ, Christian Hernandez.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah. The other day, he came over to my house, and it was funny because he was only supposed to stay for, 10 minutes? And then we ended up talking about theology for 2 hours.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was...
We could go on forever.
Yeah, definitely. And across from me, we have Alejandra. She is the Sheologian studying at Lee University in Tennessee.
Yes. Hello.
Yeah, so today is a very special podcast, and I am just thrilled. I've been trying to get this gentleman on for quite a while now, and we finally got him. We sell his book here, Cold Case Christianity, but before he comes on, let me just give you a quick introduction. So Jim Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective, popular national speaker, and best-selling author of 3 famous books, which we sell here: Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith. He continues to consult on cold case investigations today, and he's also a professor of apologetics at Biola University. He was a vocal atheist until the age of 35, and when he took a serious and expansive look at the evidence for the Christian worldview, Christianity was demonstrably true, and after becoming a Christian in 1996, Jim continued to take an evidential approach to truth as he examined the Christian worldview. He has a master's degree in theological studies at Golden Gate Baptist Theological Seminary. He served as a youth pastor and also planted a church in 2006. Jim has appeared on television and radio shows. He's done investigative work. He's been nationally recognized on Court TV, on Fox News. He's also come out on the movie God's Not Dead. He's won a lot of awards, I guess, in his field of his detective work. So none other than Jim Warner Wallace. Thank you for coming on to the Bridge Ministry podcast.
Well, I'm glad to be on. I mean, we talked yesterday briefly. I was just glad to get this arranged on my channel. I hope it wasn't too hard to kind of locate to do that, but I'm really looking forward to talking.
Actually, it was funny because whenever I called you yesterday, it definitely seemed like you were in a rush. No,
I think what it was, you called me. I was coming back from Denver. This is like the craziest speaking schedule, right, that I've got this year.
Okay.
Next year we're going to try to pare back a little bit. So I would think I was either just getting off the plane or just getting on the plane to Denver. And so now today I'm sitting here in the middle of our 90-degree. So you were saying where you are, it's actually hotter than 90? Is that what it is?
I think so. How hot is it? Yeah, I mean it's we live in Texas for the listeners
right.
who are not in Texas or in our community, but yeah, it gets so hot over here, man.
Oh, yeah, it's gone up to 108.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, my dad is in Hughes Springs, Texas, which is out toward the Louisiana border. So he's right, maybe just about probably 70 miles from Shreveport. So you can kind of get a sense of where he is, right there on the border of Texas. It's really humid. So 100 degrees where you are probably feels worse than 100 degrees where I am because we're up against the coast.
Yeah.
So it's dry, but man, it's for us. This is actually hot. So we actually are running the air conditioning today, which we don't often do.
Yeah.
But we are running it today. So.
I see.
Stay cool while we're talking, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on. Steve and Leanne, who are the founders of this ministry, they couldn't be here. They're actually on a vacation in Grand Rapids, Michigan, but they thank you for coming on. So, and we hope to have you again in the future. So,
well, I'm a huge supporter of the brick and mortar bookstores, right? Because let's face it, you guys are in a kind of a rarefied air. There's not a lot of brick and mortars anymore, and so I think this is really important. And the coffee shop side of what you're doing is probably as important as anything else, because it gives you a chance to probably bump into people who aren't believers, who aren't necessarily convinced this is true, or maybe never even heard the evidence for why it might be true. So this is a good opportunity to talk to people.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, we get unbelievers and just people who say, oh, this is a coffee shop, let me just go ahead and walk in, and they walk in, and
sure, yeah,
we get an opportunity to share the gospel, and they see the Bibles and books, and some of them will even look thinking it's just a normal bookstore, and we've even had people just pick up a book, just cause, and sit down and read and have a cup of coffee. So it's great. So
that's awesome.
Yeah. All right. So I've been reading Cold Case Christianity. I have not finished it, but I've gone probably about a quarter through it. But one of the first questions I wanted to ask you, especially for our listeners who don't know who you are, in the preface of Cold Case Christianity, could you explain for our listeners the difference between belief that and belief in, and how understanding that impacted your journey from becoming an atheist to becoming a Christian? A little bit of your testimony.
Yeah, I've talked about this before, and I probably wrote about it. People love to buy books with testimonial stuff in them, and I'm not usually big on that, right? And I kind of felt like I didn't come to faith on the basis of someone else's testimony. But I often wonder, why anybody's even interested in mine. But I always thought that my testimony was pretty boring. But for me, I was not a believer. I was not raised in an environment where I had a lot of Christians in my life. My parents were not believers. I was about 35 when my wife, who was raised in an environment where her mom was a believer, she was interested, kind of didn't really know what Christianity taught. We didn't possess a Bible. We had been together about 10 years, about 18 years, 10 years married, before I started getting interested in just looking at what did Christianity teach. She really wanted to go to church, I think, for the most part, because she felt like it'd be a good place to raise up our kids, with some values and ideas that she at least had heard about as growing up herself. So I was willing to go to church, but as an unbeliever. Now, when I got there, the pastor did pitch Jesus in an interesting way. He was a guy who was really good at kind of communicating to people who were not Christians. And he said on that first Sunday that I attended his church, and I was, again, willing to go as an atheist because I wanted to honor my wife's wishes, but I was not interested in Christianity. He said Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived. That was his basic claim. Now, he said a bunch of other stuff, too, but that was the claim that really... Also, he said that Jesus' morals teaching was the foundation of Western civilization. Yeah. And here I was working at that time, I was working undercover, and I was a detective and working a bunch of different kinds of cases, mostly robberies and some murders. And I was thinking, hey, here I am enforcing the laws of our country as if these were, objectively true. And here's a guy who's saying, well, they're all grounded in the teaching of Jesus. So I bought a Bible, and I started taking a look at it. Now, as I investigated this, I got to a place where I believed that the Gospels were reliable in what they were telling me about Jesus. That's a good first step. But that does not make you a Christian. As a matter of fact, that just kind of gets you to a factual understanding of the Gospels. And so I was at that place, at least to start. How I try to put the difference is when working officer-involved shootings, I've had a number of scary officer-involved shootings. And if you work on a homicide team, you often end up doing officer-involved shootings, too. And in one of these officer-involved shootings, I had a guy who was wearing his bulletproof vest, a vest that he had seen stop bullets in the range, because we test our bulletproof vest in the range all the time. And he had seen it stop bullets. And on this particular night, he pulls over a guy that he thinks is just a drunk driver. But when he gets him out of the car, he realizes this guy's more than a drunk driver. As a matter of fact, this guy was armed. He was a parolee. He had a gun in his waistband that the officer did not know about. And he decided that night that he was going to take the officer's life rather than get caught with the gun and do a year in the county jail or a year in state prison. he decided to kill this guy, to kill the officer. He had no idea it was coming. When the guy pulled the gun and pointed it at him, the officer was so caught by surprise that he didn't even have his own hand near his own gun. He realized he had a couple of choices here.
Yeah.
He could run, he could duck behind his car, he could hit the deck. He decided instead, though, to stand still and take the first couple of rounds from the bad guy because he knew he had his bulletproof vest on.
Yeah.
And he knew that that vest could stop rounds. And so he decided, well, I'm just going to let it do its job, and I'll get a chance to shoot back once I get my own gun out of my holster. And I thought I was listening to him tell me this story because I'm there after the shooting, and clearly he survived it because he's talking to me about it.
Right.
I thought to myself, wow, how many of us would trust that vest that profoundly to confidently stand and just, it's going to feel like you're getting hammered in the chest, but you're not going to, you're going to survive it if if he hits you in the chest, hopefully, where your vest is. But my point was, he moved in that second from a position of belief that to a position of belief in. He believed that the vest could do its job, but until that moment, he'd never had to trust in it.
Yeah.
And now he did.
Yeah.
He had to trust in the vest. And for me, that was one of those quick illustrations in my own mind. As I'm listening to his story, I'm thinking to myself, wow, how many of us as Christians are in that position, where we might believe the propositions of Christianity, the doctrinal statements, the theological statements of Christianity, but we haven't yet trusted it with our lives. We haven't yet moved into a position of trust. I was, for a long time, probably for several months, in a position where I understood what it taught and I believed it was true, but I had not yet kind of read what Scripture said about me. In other words, I had been focused on the person of Jesus. And you can believe that by focusing on Jesus in the Gospels. But once you start to read about what the Gospels say about you, what Paul says about you, in other words, I still didn't understand my own need for a Savior as I was examining the claims of the Gospels. And as I understood more and more, started focusing more and more on what it said about me, that's where I started to transition from that belief that to belief in.
Interesting. Yeah. One thing about your book that I absolutely love is it's kind of like a suspense thriller at some aspects of the book, and I'm like, this is great. But that was definitely beautifully said.
Well, I can tell you that's what I was hoping, right? I mean, I knew. Look, you for people who are out there making the case, and there's tons of them. They're right in Texas, in the Houston area, for example, south of you guys. But I mean, there's got HBU, Houston Baptist University. At least Strobel is there, Case for Christ. He is there. Lots of people are there, and as I look at that group, I think, oh look, I'm going to come into that mix. And I'm only going to be able to offer so much to people who want to look at the evidence for the case. And so for me, I think what I can offer is, number one, I understand how to work with evidence. And so I can offer that. And I also think there are some important analogies we can make to criminal trials. If you're looking to discover whether or not you can trust the gospel authors, well, there's actually a method in place that most people aren't aware of by which we evaluate eyewitnesses. And if you apply that methodology, you can either come up believing or disbelieving, but at least you'll know how to approach the eyewitnesses. That's what I'm trying to offer in cold case Christianity.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and it's excellent. So, what was the first evidence that led you to the journey into the claims of the Gospels? It was kind of the first one you went at.
Well, the thing that kind of got me started and interested because I figured, look, I'm going to pick up this book. This book records allegedly some statements of this guy named Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, great. I was interested in wise guys, and this guy's been described as a wise man. Okay, great. I was interested, for example, as a high schooler in the writings of Baha'u'llah, who is the prophet of Baha'i faith. And he's got some very beautiful proverbial statements that he wrote mostly while he was in custody. Most of it was written in his own blood. This guy was a very interesting prophet, or very interesting wise sage. That's kind of what I figured Jesus would be. So I'm reading through the Gospels, trying to mine out the wisdom statements of Jesus. Really expecting them to be more like Proverbs, rather than this historical narrative. And when I realized that the Gospels were not going to be a set of Proverbs, they were going to be a historical narratives. Well, then I started getting interested in whether or not they were actually recording something true, because it seems that the people who wrote them want us to believe that either they saw this stuff or that they had access to the people who saw this stuff. Well, that's fine. That's about what I do for a living. And then as I'm reading through it, I started to see the attributes that I typically see when you've got more than one witness who makes a claim about an event, because we get to the crime scene, we get called out, we're 3 hours behind the murder or 2 hours behind the murder.
Mm-hmm.
When we get there, the only thing we hope is that the officers who are first on scene have separated the eyewitnesses, because we know if they don't separate the eyewitnesses, they're going to talk to each other. And then they're going to get stories that are going to sound pretty much the same. And we don't want that. We want them to be separated so that their stories will have the degree of variation that we expect from reliable eyewitnesses. Because no witnesses ever agree about details. They just don't. I mean, that's not been my common experience. And if they do agree, I'm thinking, okay, did anybody separate these people before I got here? Because they shouldn't agree.
Yeah.
And they do. So as I'm reading through the Gospels, I'm going, wow, there's about the level of variation that I typically see in eyewitness accounts. It doesn't appear that anyone tried to harmonize these and create one unified account. I was glad to see the subtle differences. And then I started to see the kind of really unintentional eyewitness support that I talked about in God's Not Dead 2, where what you really have are people making a claim. One witness makes a claim, and that claim that he makes has questions that he raises. In other words, his claim has something that doesn't make sense. But sure enough, the second witness comes along and offers the detail that now makes sense of the first person's statement. This happens all the time in my cold cases. And cold cases are just unsolved murders. I've got them going back to about 1979.
Right.
So I mean, these are just unsolved murders. But so I started to recognize this unintentional eyewitness support. I talk about it in the book a little bit. They're usually described as the undesigned coincidences of the Gospels. And when I started to see that stuff, I was like, okay, now I got to test it now. I got to really lean in here, because this is starting to look like it's more than just mythology. It's starting to look like at least these people thought they were recording something true. And that's when I started to actually evaluate that under the kind of template that we typically use for eyewitnesses.
Right. Yeah, I think that was such a light bulb moment for me in my Christian faith, which it's because I still feel like some Christians today, they kind of hold this view, and then it kind of gets pushed on us by the secular worldview that what we're reading in the New Testament is mythology. And it wasn't until I heard Dr. Gary Habermas, whom I know you know, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
and good friend. Good guy too.
And it wasn't until he kind of really broke that frame of mind that no, this is eyewitness testimony that these people are writing down. This was written as actual events. These are actual places. These are actual people. And not only is it recorded in the Bible, but there's also external evidence to support what is written in the New Testament, in the Gospels.
That's right.
Yeah, and can you kind of go through the external evidence for the claims that are made in the New Testament?
Okay, so no, by the way, Gary's a very good friend, and we were just talking about this on email back and forth this last week. And he was looking for the citations from the jury instructions in California that actually help you evaluate witnesses. So he's a really smart guy. Anyway,
yeah, he is.
For me, part of it, looking at one aspect of corroboration is one aspect of reliability of witnesses is corroboration. So you're looking at four things: were they really there to see what it is they said they saw? Because people will tell you they're a witness, but they could be lying to you. They may not have even been there. So I got at least first lock down were they really there. Two, can they be corroborated by some kind of additional source, another eyewitness, something internally they said makes sense and surprises you, something the way to corroborate their statement. Third, have they changed their story over the time? Have they been honest and accurate without variation over time? And then finally, four is do they possess a bias, some kind of bias, that would cause them to lie to you. So what I was trying to do here is to look at the second category, which is corroboration. And what would that even amount to? Well, a couple of things, and I try to offer examples of this in the book. You could look at other additional eyewitnesses, especially people who you would expect to be hostile to the story to begin with. So let's imagine, for example, that you were at a bank and the bank's being robbed, and the guy walks up and he leans over the counter and he screams at the teller, "Give me all your money," and then he goes off. There's some ways to corroborate what your statement. You tell me about it, but how do I know you're telling me the truth? Well, I can look for corroboration. If you said, for example, that he leaned on the counter, I'd be looking for a palm print on the counter. Because you said he leaned there, I should be able to see a palm print. If there's an additional witness, right? Now, I might get this guy in custody down the road, and I'll say to him, "Dude, I know you were in that bank." And he'll say to me, "Well, no, I wasn't really in that bank." I got videotape of you in the bank.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I was in the bank, but I wasn't really there for a robbery. I was there to make a deposit.
Mm-hmm.
So you walked over, and I saw you write the demand note on the counter, and that where the little pieces of paper were. No, I was just writing my deposit slip.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, dude. Okay, then you go over to the teller, right? Yeah. You started screaming at the teller, didn't you? Well, I forgot my keys in the car. That's all I was upset about. So in other words, he has now told me a bunch of stuff. He's not confessed to the robbery.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think I'm going to use his statements in my investigation? Of course I am. And in trial, I'm going to use those statements because he has reluctantly admitted to several things about the robbery, that he was there at the time of the robbery, that he did exactly what the witnesses said he did prior to the robbery, that he even had contact with the teller. He's just trying to convince me it's for some other cause, for some other reason.
Right.
Well, it turns out that there are hostile eyewitnesses to the early church in the first century who understood the claims of Christianity very early, yet they denied they were actually what they said they were. They had to reluctantly, though, admit to certain details, the same way my robber reluctantly admits to certain details, in order to say that it didn't happen. So, for example, if you've got, like, say, Tacitus, or Thallus is even better. Thallus will talk about the darkness that occurred at the crucifixion, but he claims that darkness is a product of an eclipse. He wants to provide natural explanations for all this supernatural claims. Okay, fine. But in order to make that claim he makes, that it's just an eclipse, he has to reluctantly admit that there was a guy named Jesus who was crucified on that day, and there was darkness at his crucifixion. So he's like the robber who says, I'm in the bank, but I'm not doing a robbery. Well, Thallus kind of says, yeah, this happened, but it's not the supernatural stuff that they said it is. Well, at least he confirms for us, reluctantly, the existence of Jesus on a cross, crucified in darkness. That's not bad. If you make a list of all of the hostile, non-Christian authors of the first, say, 50 to 60 years after the crucifixion, you're going to get a bunch of detail, reluctantly, from people who don't believe it's as it was written in Scripture, but they do give you facts and details that coincide with the Christian story. I make a list of those in Cold Case Christianity, and I think that really is helpful because it gives us data points by which we can corroborate the Christian story.
Yeah. Could you talk about Josephus a little bit and what he is to our audience? Because he's another external source. So, and kind of how his role kind of plays into what we're talking about.
Yeah, and some people look. So Josephus is an ancient Jewish historian who offers some details about both Jesus, about John the Baptist, some details about different characters from Scripture. But people will offer, and it's true, that the earliest Christians did corrupt some of the accounts of Josephus. So you have several versions of the Josephus account that have been found in antiquity, some that have been elaborated upon by Christians. But this should not cause us then to throw every Josephus claim under the bus. In fact, I think we can look at the more ancient Josephus copies we have, and especially if they're coming from an area that is not how shall I say, doesn't favor the Christian worldview. So I'm using Arabic sources of Josephus because we have a tendency to think that those are the least corrupted because they're not being held in Christian communities. They're being held in non-Christian communities. So we've got a good reason to believe they are uncorrupted. So if you look at the most austere, stripped version of the Josephus account that we can find in a non-Christian community, so it's free from Christian corruption, well, then you're going to get some detail about Jesus that, again, is reluctantly admitted by somebody who does not believe that Jesus is who he said he was. Yeah. Yet he will make statements about Jesus that are compelling. They give us data points, just like the robber says things that give us data points. And I think that's really helpful. Look, if you were just to take the details that are offered by Josephus, by Tacitus, by Thallus, by Marabar Serapion, by Phlegon. Just take the earliest accounts we can find. So they're still within the lifetime of eyewitnesses who would have been there to know what they were saying. Yeah. And you were to assemble those, you'd be amazed at the amount of detail. I write about this also in a book called Forensic Faith that is offered by these non-believers who are actually hostile to the Christian story. So I think this is one of those things where it's just so helpful for us, right, to be able to assemble the hostile. Again, the way you make cases is you get a data point, and then you're looking for corroborative evidence but it's going to be incomplete. Here's what I mean. Back when we were in the bank, and you said you saw that bank robber lean over the counter to do the bank robbery, if you said, okay, he said, yeah, he leaned over, he yelled at the guy, pointed the gun at him, and he said, give me your money. Well, I'm looking for a way to corroborate your statement. So I go back to the counter, and I lift the palm print off the counter. That's right where you said he put his hand. So this palm print will actually corroborate your statement as a witness. Yet, the palm print says nothing to me about whether or not the guy had a gun.
Yeah.
You said that, but the palm print can't confirm that. It doesn't say anything about what the suspect said. Now, you said he said something, but the palm... So, in other words, every piece of corroborative evidence is what I would call touch point corroboration. It only gives me a small piece of your claim. And we would consider that in a criminal trial to be more than enough to corroborate your claim. So here, if we find some archaeological evidence, for example, that supports the claims of the New Testament, we don't have to find every possible piece of archaeological evidence in order to feel that we are sufficiently corroborated. You know what I'm saying? So this is what we're trying to do here, is to build the corroboration. But if you expect us to be able to find a piece of corroborative evidence for every single detail of the New Testament, you're going to be just... But you should find something, but you're not going to find everything. And by the way, that's okay, because that's the nature of criminal cases. You have to learn to live with unanswered questions.
Yeah. In Chapter 1, there's a section titled An Ancient Death Scene Investigation. You talk about Dr. Gary Habermas's minimal fact approach. Could you unpack that for our audience, kind of just what it entails, and if you use that for... your investigation for the New Testament?
Yeah, I didn't know Gary back in those days, but I didn't even know about his minimal facts. I later on read about minimal facts. But I just knew this: there were some things as an atheist that I would have said were true. I would have given them to you if you were a Christian debating me. I wasn't going to deny, for example, the existence of Jesus. There's all these Jesus mythers who want to say that he's borrowed from prior mythology.
They're so funny.
I'm not crazy, okay? I mean, like Bart Ehrman himself, as a skeptic, knows that Jesus actually lived. But this does not mean that he rose from the dead. I would have also said to you that two things. I would have said, I think that the tomb was empty, and I do think that the initial eyewitnesses went to their death without ever recanting. Because the quickest way to end this in the first century is just get the body of Jesus and drag it around town, or get the original eyewitnesses to recant. But the fact that neither of those two things happens, does not mean that the story is true.
Yeah.
So I would have given you the existence of Jesus, that he died on a cross, that he was buried in a tomb, the tomb is empty, the people who made the claims never changed their story, but I still would have denied the resurrection.
Yeah.
So what I would have to do is give you an alternative explanation for those minimal pieces of evidence. That's what Gary helps us do. He does a survey of all of the scholarship, and it turns out the scholarship that's out there, whether they're conservative Christians or all the way on the other side of the spectrum, and they are unbelieving, skeptical historians, they all have a high level of certainty about certain key things. He makes a list of, I think 14 or 15 of these things, but I never would have given you those. I would have only given you 4 things.
You gave us 4 in the book.
Yeah, and that's all I would have given you as a skeptic. But still, you got to explain those 4. Now, it turns out, I think I do a talk where I think I give 7 different possible explanations for those 4 pieces of evidence. The problem is that none of those explanations work as well as the Christian explanation. And the Christian explanation only has one weakness. It requires us to believe in something supernatural called the resurrection. But from an evidential perspective, in terms of how well it accounts for the empty tomb, accounts for the conversions of the eyewitnesses and their steadfast approach to what they claimed.
Yeah.
The fact it accounts for everything brilliantly.
Yeah.
But it requires you to believe. But if the thing we're actually investigating to begin with is whether or not the supernatural explanation of the resurrection is the most reasonable explanation, you can't begin by denying the supernatural. And the only thing that ever kept me out for all that time was my steadfast denial of the supernatural. So in other words, you can't investigate a supernatural claim with the presupposition that nothing supernatural occurs. You have to at least suspend your doubt and put it on the shelf and be fair to the investigation. I was never fair to the investigation. Now, once I realized that, it helped me to be fair, and then I realized, as an atheist, I already believed in several extra natural events that most people take for granted. For example, I was a big bang cosmologist. I believe that the entire universe, all space, time, and matter, leapt into existence from nothing at a point in the distant past. That means that the cause of all space, time, and matter cannot be space, time, or matter, because it doesn't exist. It's caused by something other than space, time, or matter. Now think about that.
Yeah.
When we talk about nature, we're talking about space, time, and matter. There's nothing else that is included in that reference point.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the laws of physics and chemistry are simply acting on space, time, and matter. Yet here now, I'm suggesting there is a cause that is not space, time, or it's something extra natural.
Yeah.
Well, you're already there. As a matter of fact, my atheist friends right now are just like me. They believe that something other than space, time, or matter created the entire universe. That's what I believe as a Christian. The only difference is they believe it's an impersonal force. I believe the best explanation is a personal force. And so I think once you realize that, it allowed me to assess, look, if there's something out there that's powerful enough to create everything in the universe from nothing, I'm betting he can probably walk on water. And then all of the miracles in the New Testament became available to me again because I realized I already believed in the grand miracle maker.
Yeah, yeah, it's so true.
It's
When you just talk about, I mean, if God created the whole entire universe as a Christian believes, walking on water and raising Christ from the dead, and some atheists will shoot the argument of, oh, so you believe in talking donkeys? And I'll go, yeah. Like the creator of the universe could reveal himself in whichever way he wants to. So that's
right.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, just on the topic of atheism, also too in your book you talk about how this, which is very prevalent right now in our culture, is that materialism, the naturalism, the
scientism.
The scientism, yeah, and it becomes a mental roadblock for some, and also for Christians. I think unconsciously, I think we kind of hold on to it sometimes, and if you kind of just like unpack how just that's like a folly, just materialism and scientism.
Yeah, well, I mean, this idea is kind of a claim that the culture provides now, and it's inconsistent in its claims, though. Let me tell you why. I have a lot of friends who are not Christians who believe that the only way to know something is to be able to run a scientific experiment in order to validate it. And they would say something akin to, I can only believe those things that I can test and confirm with science. And I get that. And certainly, as we've kind of seen the progress of science over the last 4 generations, it does. I can see why there's an elevated expectation that science will get all the answers for you. But just think about the claim itself, that I can only believe things that I can test and confirm with science. Really? Well, I know one thing that you believe without being able to test or confirm it with science. The claim that you can only believe things you can test and confirm with science, because that claim is not a scientific claim. It's not even scientifically verifiable.
Yeah.
It is a philosophical presupposition that you began with that is entirely philosophical. Now, you may have noticed that there's places in the culture, a culture that embraces this form of scientism for almost anything. That's why they would say they reject supernatural claims like theism, right, or any form of Christian theism. Yet it turns out that we are now moving into an entire category of thinking, gender theory, that cannot be tested with science. There is no science of gender. There's a science of sex. In other words, I can use DNA to determine your sex at birth. I know about a crime scene if I'm looking for a male or a female. From the DNA swab, I know what I'm looking for. I even know the race of what I'm looking for, okay, from the crime scene. But you cannot, there's no science of gender. This is the one area that most people who are committed to scientism are willing to abandon scientism altogether for an entirely philosophical approach to sexual identity.
Yeah.
Now think about that for a second. This is the same culture that would say, prove it to me with science. But they cannot prove gender theory because a guy or whoever's speaking to them can change their gender identity 4 times in the same talk.
Yeah.
So how is that possible? Well, there's no science of this. This is a philosophical view of gender theory, which is why, for example, we call it gender theory. There is no gender science. And that's why, and of course, what you're going to see is they're going to try to argue about that and try to redefine the word science in order to argue that this is an entirely scientific, you've got no choice in the matter in order how you think about your own gender. But in the end, that is an entirely philosophical position they're taking.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of those areas where you see that that the culture is thinking about scientism starts to break down when it's convenient for them to break it down. But even the statement itself that you can only trust things that you can confirm with science is not something you can confirm. So it's self-refuting to begin with.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was an excellent response. I love that. Moving back to the cold case Christianity before I open it up to Allah and Christian to give some topics back to the New Testament. So how is it that we know like the disciples didn't lie? You know, it wasn't this mass hallucination that some people claim. Like, how do we know the observations weren't distorted later on throughout history? Like there was
you've asked. Right. Now you've asked three different questions.
Yeah.
So there's three ways. These are three things that I had to test myself.
Yeah.
Number one, is it a lie? Two, did they hallucinate it? Or three, was it corrupted over time?
Yeah.
Now those are ways to explain the four pieces of evidence we talked about. Those four minimal pieces. Let's just take them one at a time really quickly. The lies are about conspiracies, and I think once people have worked conspiracies, if you've ever had to investigate and file a case in a criminal court for a conspiracy, you know how hard it is to pull off a conspiracy. Mm-hmm. If I'm going to trial with a conspiracy, it's because I've caught them and it's not successful. If you think you know of a successful conspiracy, well, then it's not by definition successful. You don't know about successful conspiracies because people got away with them. The fact that we catch so many of them demonstrates the fact that it's very hard to pull it off. You need 5 things in place in order to pull off a conspiracy. Number one, you need the lowest possible number of people involved. 2 people can lie easier than 22. You need the lowest amount of time, smallest, shortest amount of time. You can tell a lie for a day easier than for a year. Mm-hmm. You need excellent communication between co-conspirators so that if one person says something to the authorities, everyone else has to match his story identically. You've got to be able to talk to each other and say what you're telling. You can't. You're, whatever you start off with, eventually it's going to be changed over time. So, and the fourth thing is you have to hopefully have some family relationship or some really strong commitment. And finally, you just need low pressure. If no one's asking or pressuring you, lie together forever. It turns out under those 5 things, I am able to break every conspiracy I've ever had to work. Because sometimes you'll get 4 people to do a murder, and they conspire to do it, but you just break those 5 things, and you'll get to the truth.
Yeah.
You don't think those 5 things could have been broken for, 500-plus people who would have to hold this conspiracy together? That's a very small number, I'm suggesting, because Paul says 500 people saw the resurrection the same day. There's probably 120 people in the upper room who are candidates to replace Judas. There's the 12 disciples. How many multitudes of disciples saw the ascension, for crying out loud? Mm-hmm. We don't know. But we know there's a large number of people who have to keep that together over a long period of time without any communication, under intense pressure, and all die doing it. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Is that possible? Certainly it's possible. But is it reasonable? No. Yeah. And I don't care about possible. I only care about reasonable. Yeah. So that's where I thought, okay, I can toss that to the side. Now, the other questions about whether they hallucinated, well, that's the problem with that, of course, is that it's one thing for me to hallucinate under intense pressure or hallucinate because I want it so badly. Mm-hmm. But then you don't even want it to be true, like Paul. Is he hallucinating on the road to Damascus? Then you have multiple people on the road to Emmaus, the 3 Marys, the 7 people at the lake, the 10 people minus Judas and Thomas when they first see him in the upper room. Add Thomas, now we're at 11. Yeah. How many more saw him on the ascension? I mean, we're talking about group hallucinations, and by the way, it'd be pretty easy to confirm whether that's a hallucination or not. Just run back to the tomb. If you're hallucinating this, there should be no body in the tomb. Yeah. But there is, there should be a body in the tomb, rather, because you've hallucinated it. But there is no body in the tomb, and that's the problem. Yeah. So I think is it possible? I don't even think that's it. There's no documentation of group hallucinations in the history of hallucinations, so I don't think you can even go that way. And finally, did it change over time? That's one area that I hope is of greatest value in this book I wrote, because I don't think anyone else has taken this approach. We know that we have to track evidence in criminal cases all the way from the point at which it was found into the jury, to the courtroom. If it's 30 years later, we have to ask the question, who collected that? Who did that officer give it to? Did he describe it well when he first saw it? And what did he write about it? Then when he gave it to somebody, they would write another report listing everything they saw. Mm-hmm. Did he describe it the same way as the first officer, the next officer? This is called the chain of custody, and you can follow it through the years, every place the evidence has been. Then it goes into storage for 30 years. It comes out. The first analyst, who was that? What did he say? Who did he give it to? We go person by person by person over the years to see if evidence has changed. Well, you can actually form a chain of custody between for example, John. John sees something. Well, how do we know what John saw? Maybe he was a simpler version of Jesus. Maybe that document's been corrupted thousands of times over history. The story of Jesus changed. Really? Well, John had the first officers in the chain of custody for John were John's personal students, Ignatius, Papias, and Polycarp. We can actually see what they said about Jesus in their writings to local churches. And it turns out that they described Jesus the exact same way we see him in the Gospel of John. They had a student, Irenaeus was a student of Polycarp and Ignatius. What does Irenaeus say he learned from those two? It matches exactly what John says. He's got a student named Hippolytus. What does Hippolytus say? I actually think that Hippolytus has got a student named Origen, but I'm not going to stretch it too far. The point is, we can trace the story to see if it changes. You may not like the story, that he's born of a virgin and works miracles and ascends into heaven and dies on all that stuff. You may not like that story, but that story is the earliest story. It's written early enough to have been written by eyewitnesses, and it never changes over time. You're stuck with the story. You can still deny it. I get that. But you can't argue it's been changed because it hasn't changed.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to pass it on over to Christian, my friend. He's got a question.
Hi, yes, Mr. Wallace. I just want to ask, there's common objections regarding the reliability of the New Testament. You hear this a lot from skeptics and liberal scholars such as Bart Ehrman. And one of the biggest objections I get is specifically the authorship of the Gospels. That the claim is that we have no idea who wrote the Gospels, that they're anonymous. And I wanted to see if you could probably rebut this in the sense that we have good reason to believe that Matthew wrote Matthew and then Mark wrote Mark. Do you believe that there is a tradition that traces like way earlier to say that these are the original authors of the gospel?
Yeah, I think a couple of things about this. It's one thing for sure. The earliest and consistent testimony of those who would know better, those who were the earliest bishops, who were the friends of the friends, who were the friends of the actual authors. People like Papias himself will talk about the authorship of Mark's gospel and who Mark was. All of it is consistent with the titles that we have and the authorship claims that we have on the Gospels today. But this is for the sake of argument, because as a skeptic myself, looking at these Gospels for the first time, I couldn't care less if John wrote John's Gospel. I mean, I don't ever wonder why this is a concern. Who cares who wrote Mark's Gospel? Who cares really Matthew wrote Matthew? The Gospels, though, seem to claim that they were written by someone who saw this stuff. Okay. I don't care if it's Matthew. I don't care if it's John. I honestly don't. Because I'm going to test it to find out, does this look like somebody who was really there to see what he said he saw? Does this look like it's been altered or can it be corroborated over in some way? Does it look like it's been altered over time? Does it look like the writer who wrote it has got some bias? It doesn't really matter to me. Here's the whole point. Somebody was there to see this, and they identified themselves as the one that Jesus, the beloved disciple. Is that John, the apostle? Is that an elder John? Is that some other? The question is, was the writer there early enough? Did the appearance of the document appear early enough to have actually been written by somebody who would have seen it with their own eyes? Because that's when I can begin to test it. Now, the reason why that's powerful is for a couple of things. Number one, if it's written early enough, it can be written by people who actually did see it. But two, it can be verified. In other words, it's hard to write a lie in the same generation of people who would have actually known the truth. So if there's a lie in there, it's harder to write it. If you're going to write a lie, you need to either one, wait till everyone who knew Jesus is dead, or two, write it out of the region. What we have instead are Gospels that are written early enough to have been written by people who would know better. You know, it's hard to lie to those people, and it's in the region where the people would actually have lived who would still know the truth. So in the end, to me, the authorship was not nearly as critical as the reliability of the content. Does that make sense? So I've always wondered why this. I mean, of course, what you want to do in order to attack Christianity is just to kind of chip away at the edges. Defense attorneys always do this, but they're missing the forest through the trees. They want the jury to focus on this one issue, right? But they're missing the overall picture. And what you have to do is look at the cumulative case. So if I've got 15 pieces of evidence that all point to the same defendant, I guarantee you that defense attorney is going to try to find one he can chip away at. Then he's going to want to hope that the jury sees that, well, hey, if this is false, maybe the whole thing falls down. Really? Cumulative cases, if you're wondering how to interpret piece 99, let the other 98 pieces guide you. Okay? They're all pointing to the same conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So I always look at that and say, okay, that's a nice rabbit trail that people want to take me on, but I'm willing to concede that to you just for sake of argument. I always say it this way. Bart argues that there are so many variations between the ancient manuscripts you can't trust them. Okay, Bart, for sake of argument, I'm willing to concede and take out, remove from the Gospels, every verse in which you find a single variant. As a matter of fact, I'm willing to concede to Bart. He can take out all the evens or all the odd verses. Take them out. Call those unreliable. Do you think you're going to lose the story of Jesus by taking out every other verse?
Yeah.
No, you're not. As a matter of fact, most of those information is going to come back in because the verse you took out in Matthew, you left in Luke, and so you have parallel verses that come back in again. And number two, the story is so redundant and repeated, and everything's you're stuck with a miraculous Jesus of Nazareth, born of a virgin, who died on a cross, who rose from the grave, who ascended into heaven, and seated at the right hand of the Father. No matter if you took out every other verse. And no skeptic is saying that this thing is so unreliable that you should take out every other verse. But that's my point, is that you can see what they're doing is they're trying to focus on a tree to make the entire culture ignore the forest.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
This is me, Alejandra. I just have a question. It goes back to your personal testimony. And
Yes.
I think it was in one interview that I heard you mention this, that before you became a Christian, you would see that there was a separation between you and the people behind the bars, pretty much. You're like, I know, like, if you would tell me I was a sinner, I would tell you, no, I'm not. Like, I know how sinners look like. And I was very interested in your statement when you say that when you became a Christian, pretty much that bar that separated you and the sinner pretty much fade out. There was no difference between you and the criminals. Can you mention this or expand this for our listeners?
Yeah, I think what you kind of see is, and I always kind of use this illustration. I don't work serial killers. Serial killers are pretty rare. I work cold case killers. They're different. So when you arrest a serial killer and you knock on the door of their neighbor, that neighbor's going to say, man, I'm so glad you got that guy in custody. That guy's a freak, man. He's up all night. The place smells bad. He's weird. Because serial killers are repeatedly doing the same crime over and over again, and they are odd, okay? But when I work a cold case killer, this is a guy who did one murder 30 years ago. Just one. He never did one before that. He's never going to do another one. He did one murder at a point of rage, and he spent the next 30 years living a regular life. Just like you and me. He doesn't look any different. His neighbor says, you're not taking that guy to jail. I've known that guy forever.
Right.
He like watches my kids. I can tell you that's the nice. You're wrong about him. He's a nice guy. So that made me realize that which worldview of all the worldviews that we could embrace actually explains human anthropology, explains the human condition,
right?
As well as Christianity. I mean, I've got a lot of defense attorneys that I work with who are not Christians. And they are just convinced, based on the character of the man they're working with today, that there's no way a man like that could ever do something so horrific, right? Whereas you and I know, having a Christian worldview, that no, that's everyone. That's all of us. All of us are capable of great depravity because of our fallen sin nature. There is no good person. We're all bad people in need of a savior, and we have episodes and seasons of our life when we're able to kind of keep our act together and fool the world. But we all know that right below the surface, we are that same guy who in a moment with the right buttons pushed could do something horrific. And once you realize that, at least you recognize that when you're sitting across the table from someone like that, but for the grace of God, that could be you.
Yeah.
Because that could be all of us.
Right.
Yeah.
That's who we are. That's why every one of us is in need of a savior. And if you think that you're so buttoned up that you could never do such a thing, you've got another problem, is that you're either a fool or a liar.
Yeah.
You know, that's the problem, is that we are that same. So now look, I kind of have a sense, even before I was a Christian, that was probably the case. But what's great about the Christian worldview is that it describes reality the way it is. So it turns out that now my Christian worldview makes sense of the stuff I was seeing anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So we'll move a little bit from cold case Christianity and talk a little bit more about your book, God's Crime Scene. Again, we sell it here, both of them, Cold Case Christianity and God's Crime Scene. Can you talk about God's Crime Scene, and if for someone that would come and pick up the book, what could they expect? And we could just jump into some questions about that book as well.
Okay, so what I tried to do is use a strategy that would be helpful for people. Like, so once you understand how to use abductive reasoning, for example, you can kind of look at the resurrection a little better. Once you understand how to master the chain of custody, you can determine if the documents have been changed. So I'm trying to give you a skill set, a detective skill set that'll help you make a case or investigate the evidence. And when it comes to God's Crime Scene, the goal here was this. I said, okay, look, not every death scene is a crime scene. There are 4 ways to die. 3 of them are not a crime. You can die by accident, natural causes, suicide. That's not a crime. Of course, if it's a murder, the 4th category, then I have to investigate it because it's a crime. So the question becomes, how do I determine whether or not it's one of those first 3 or the latter, the homicide? Well, one kind of simple way to do it is to kind of ask yourself this simple question. If you can explain everything that's in the room where the dead body is by staying in the room with the dead body, then it's not a murder. But if the best explanation for the stuff in the room is a cause outside the room, now you've got to shift to homicide. So, for example, if you've got a gun laying by his side and there's a suicide note written in his own handwriting, and it's on a piece of paper that you find elsewhere in the room, well, then I can explain, and it's his gun, registered to him, he keeps it according to his family in a safe in the room. Well, now I can explain everything in that room by staying in the room. It's his paper, it's his gun, he needs no help from anyone outside the room in order to have that thing happen, so it's going to be either an accidental or a suicide. Now, on the other hand, if that's not his gun, and it's not registered to him, and it's not his paper, and it's not even his handwriting on that suicide note, and not even his DNA or fingerprints on the note, and I've got bloody footprints leading out of the room, well, now I got a bunch of stuff in the room that I can't explain by staying in the room. I've got to actually jump out of the room in order to explain the stuff in the room. And when that happens, everything shifts toward a homicide investigation because I have good evidence of an intruder, and intruders are the things that change death scenes into crime scenes. So now what we're doing is saying, okay, could we take the same approach to the entire natural universe? Can we explain everything that's in the universe by staying in the room? Or is the best explanation outside the room? Now, if it's outside the room, what I basically mean is it's outside of the stuff that's in the natural universe. It's space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. If space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry can't explain everything in the room, well, then I've got to jump outside the room into something that's extra natural as a better explanation. And it turns out I think there are 8 pieces of evidence I try to describe in God's Crime Scene that cannot be explained by staying in the room. The best explanation is outside the room. And that's, I think, really why I call it God's Crime Scene, not to suggest that God's committed a crime here, but to suggest that you could work the universe and investigate it like a crime scene to get to the first cause. Yeah.
Do you have a question, Christian?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, also ask, because I see that, also a lot of people might ask, like, when they're reading the Gospels or, a lot of skeptics, I guess it's important to know the difference between what people might think is a contradiction and kind of like a difference of an account in the Gospel. And I feel that, a lot of people can't make that distinction, because I know you elaborated this earlier, but I was wondering if you could kind of further explain that. Like, when people say that there's contradictions in the gospel, how would you respond? Say that's not a contradiction, it could just be a differing account, and you see this a lot in investigating criminal cases. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. A couple ways to respond to it. First, I don't see contradictions in the sense that they are irreconcilable contradictions, two things that cannot be harmonized. And remember, because this is early, and we know these are early accounts. I did an entire chapter on just that issue in Cold Case Christianity. And because we know they haven't been changed over time, the contradictions then would have been there from the very beginning. Now, it seems to me that if those people who wrote in the first century, and we know they date back to the first century, if they knew that these were contradictions, why wouldn't they just have harmonized them and taken them out? Because there's something about the accounts that are true, although they look different in terms of how they're presented to us. And I can tell you there are people who have spent a great deal of time, I tweet them all the time on my Twitter feed, who are just reconciling apparent contradictions. There's an entire body of work, books that have been written about reconciling or addressing the apparent contradictions in Scripture. And that's one way you could approach it. And I think that's valid, because there are no true irreconcilably different accounts in the Scriptures. And every time someone says this, I can show them. Well, wait a minute. If you're only identifying one of the angels at the tomb, and then another account identifies two angels, it doesn't mean that they are in contradiction. Because anytime you have two angels, you also have one. And if the first account is only referring to the conversation that occurred, it occurred apparently between only one of the angels and Mary. Okay, so I get that. I just explained a contradiction. Well, all of them are kind of like that, but I go a different route sometimes with folks, because I would offer this in my criminal trials. Okay, there's a jury instruction. Now, I'm not suggesting that any account in the Gospels is wrong, but when you're working in a criminal trial, a witness can be wrong and still be reliable. There's a jury instruction for this. In other words, I've had accounts where a woman comes in, she testifies something critical about the case, but she misses another detail. She's wrong about another. I think one account, for example, when the woman testified to finding the body, a bunch of important details, but could not remember if the door was unlocked when she first arrived at the scene. That was important because the suspect we were looking at was an employee and would have a key to get in, so we wanted to know, did he use his key to get in? So it was an important detail, and she got it wrong, completely missed it. And, of course, the defense attorney said, well, you can't trust her then on anything else because she was wrong about the door. Well, of course, when we read the jury instruction to the jury was instructed that, no, that's not actually true. A witness can be wrong about an account, and you can still embrace everything else the witness said because there might be a reason why the witness was wrong about that one account. So, in other words, just on its face, there's a jury instruction that says that even if there was something inaccurate in an account, it does not mean you should throw the entire account under the bus. But I'm not even suggesting that's the case. But my point is that you see how they've elevated the standard for a purpose. Yeah. Because they know that you would never, anyone you love or you're talking to, your friends, they could be wrong about a certain detail, and you wouldn't say, that guy's a liar, I'm never going to trust him again. But when it comes to this account, now I think one thing that's fair to argue here is, well, wait a minute. You're saying these accounts are divinely inspired and delivered to us in a way by God himself. So if that's the case, then I shouldn't see. What we are saying is that the autographs, the originals, are inerrant. Inerrancy always points back to the original autograph, the original copy of each manuscript. But we don't have the original copies, and we have copies that have been delivered to us over time. And we do know that when we compare the most ancient versions of these copies, as Bart Ehrman so loves to talk about, they have variations between them. Okay. But we have a process in place in which we can arrive reliably at the original intention, the original version. Is a process I talk about in the book. But the point is, we can arrive at that reliably. Now, we're not saying that copy you're holding in your hand is inerrant in the sense that it's got no variations with any other ancient. Clearly it does. But the original is the thing we are saying is the inerrant Word of God. And if God was intending to deliver something to us that we could look at and sense that it's as reliable in the way we could sense any reliable eyewitness, he's certainly done it. Because there was no effort to harmonize this and just give one account or four accounts that say word for word the same thing. If that was the case, do you think the skeptics would be any more comfortable? They would be any more convinced? No, they'd be less convinced. The fact that there is variation between the accounts is what shows that they're reliable. It's just the opposite of what the claim is. Right. If I had four identical accounts, that's when you say there's a lie. If you've got four accounts that have variations but can be harmonized, well, guess what that looks like? It looks like reliable eyewitness testimony.
Correct.
That's awesome. I have another question. Something that also caught my attention about your book is that you explain the way that you started the process, and pretty much like because of your background, you were determined of not accepting like supernatural claims or explanation, but only natural claims. And it's like you're starting with a bias pretty much, and then further on in the book you speak about bias. What would be your advice of a person who's approaching evidence, or an atheist who wants to just try to understand Christianity or in any other process? Like, for example, I'm a student of history and theology, so in history we have to do all this all the time. And it's like we all have a bias, we all have a view, like a filter, the way that we see the world. What would be your advice for just people like me who's analyzing evidence to be more objective when we do that?
Yeah, I think it can be difficult, right? Because especially when you're talking to somebody who maybe challenges on that issue, you know, how do you expect? Here's Frank Turk is a friend of mine. Is another apologist. We do a bunch of conferences.
He's
together,
great.
And Frank always kind of talks about it this way, and I think it's a great first question to ask. If Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? Now we ask people that question for a reason, not just because it's diagnostic. That's why we ask it. Because if someone says, well, I don't think it's true, well, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if it were true, would you become a Christian? And we still see people hesitate. Now, we're taking off the table the fact that if we could demonstrate somehow with evidence to beyond a possible doubt that it is true, just theoretically, nothing can be demonstrated like that, but if you could, would you become a Christian? And so many people will say no or hesitate. And you're thinking just, okay, this was not a matter of evidence. It's not a head issue. It's a heart issue. That question just diagnosed it. And I think that's a fair question for us to ask ourselves anytime we're examining these kinds of claims. Is it really a heart issue for me personally? Is it going to be a heart issue? In other words, there are so many things about the life that I'm living that I'm so in love with that I control as God that I would never want to surrender them to live a different way, especially if there was a God who had a different set of ideas about what's right and wrong. That's really an important question. I think a lot of my family who are still not Christians, it's not because, and I've already made the case evidentially to them, it's not a head issue for them. It's a heart issue. This is a volitional, willful resistance. And I think anytime you start, you got to say, look, I had this case that I talk about in some of my books, where this guy killed his wife, and he was such a nice guy that none of us wanted to believe he did it. Now, we knew evidentially there was no way around it. This guy's the killer. But, man, his family didn't believe it. The victim's family didn't believe it. They never complained that their daughter was missing. She was missing for 30 years. They didn't complain about it because they just didn't want to believe that the husband, their son-in-law, could have killed their daughter. The defense attorney who represented this guy, there's no way in his mind. He was adamant it could not have happened. Could not have been. Nobody wanted to believe it because they so liked Mike, the guy that did the murder. Well, you got to ask ourselves this: is it that am I so in love with the worldview I'm living through, that it allows me complete freedom, autonomy, and control, that's what's keeping me here? That's what's guiding my every decision about evidence. That's what's guiding my every decision about any claim made about God or lack of God, whatever. It's not whether or not there really is a God. It's whether or not I want there to be a God. And that's, I think, a fair question to ask as you're examining the evidence.
Yeah, that reminds me of Thomas Nagel's quote from The Last Words, his book, and I pulled it up right here. He says, I speak from experience. By the way, for our listeners, Thomas Nagel is an atheist. He says, I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheism to be true and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I am right in my belief. It is that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that.
Isn't that a great telling? To me, that's a wonderful quote that we often will point to because few people, both, by the way, even Christians, right? There are Christians who are not willing. I wrote the book Forensic Faith, the third book in this trilogy, because I realized there are a bunch of Christians who are not interested in looking at the evidence for this.
Right.
And I think some of them are afraid that they would find out that it's not true.
Now,
I'm here to tell you that you have great confidence in looking at the evidence, but they have the same view that Nagel has in the opposite direction.
And
so it's possible for all of us can hold that view. This view that I just don't want the opposite view to be true, so I either won't look at it, won't consider it, or I just sit here kind of in this intellectual discontent, this kind of this dissonance, this kind of rub that's bothering me. That I have this. You can tell in his writing, there's something bugging him. And I suspect if he was to come over to this side, he may also have something bugging him in the opposite direction. Right now, in his point in his life, he's kind of on the fence. He seems to be kind of sitting with one foot in each camp a little bit. But clearly, he's more on the atheist camp. But I'm just saying, you can tell. A really committed atheist like Sam Harris, who doesn't think for a second, doesn't even blink at showing disdain toward the Christian worldview. Nagel's different. You can tell. He's like, you heard him say it. I mean, it's bugging him that some of the smartest people he knows knows are in this camp. So it's interesting to hear for sure.
Yeah, I mean, throughout my whole Christian faith, I did have a fear of like Richard Dawkins and Hitchens, and I mean, I didn't even want to hear them speak because it would make me nervous till my palms were sweaty. But as I started diving into apologetics, I read your material, Frank Turk's material. Dr. James White is someone that helped me out so much. Dr. Greg Bonson, who is one of my favorite, listening to his debate against who was it?
Gordon Stein.
Oh, Gordon. Oh man, he ate him alive. And it was just like it opened my eyes, especially the debate with Dr. James White and David Silverman.
Yeah.
Oh man, like the holes that Dr. James White put in it was just great. And your work, Frank Turk, and listening to John Lennox and just the great apologists, it just made me realize that atheism and this militant atheism is really like 10% of teapot. It's really nothing to be scared of at all. And we have good reason to believe in what we believe in. And once you start looking at the evidence, it's like, wow, why was I even scared, in the first place? Why was I ever intimidated?
No, I hear you. It's very true. And so I think a lot of this is, I used to think, my mission in life is to make the case for as many non-believers as possible in order to win them the way I was won by the evidence. But I realize there's even an equally important mission I shouldn't overlook, which is that there are a lot of Christians that would be much bolder in their witness and much more liberated in the way they talk about Christianity if they had an increased confidence based on the evidence. And there's a relationship, I think, between your evidential certainty and your boldness in witnessing, your boldness. And like you said, why would you really? I mean, I see this all the time in young people, too. This idea that I would be uncomfortable listening to the other side at all. Now, how do you think you treat people who you're uncomfortable with?
Yeah.
You treat them poorly.
Yeah.
You either avoid them or pretend they don't exist or don't matter, or when you're around them, you kind of, look, Chihuahuas make a lot of noise because they're always afraid of the bigger dog, okay? Yeah. Yet Great Danes strut around like, hey, whatever. What's going to happen in this yard? There's no one here who can bother me. And so the confidence of the Great Dane is very different than the confidence of the Chihuahua. We're often like Christian Chihuahuas, right? Where we are. Yeah. We bark a lot, we puff up a lot because we're constantly in fear of our surroundings.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Dr. Greg Bonson gives a great analogy in one of his lectures that I bought. He says, like, Christians have a big revolver and there's a bear coming at you and you have a lot of good bullets in it. Just start firing. Don't shoot one time and when they rebuttal they go, well, what do I do now? Do you just keep shooting and it's going to take a couple of times to shoot before you bring the bear down, but there's nothing to be scared of. You have great ammunition and a great weapon. So
yeah, it's important. I think what happens is, and cops are bad about this too, right? We always use this language of kind of warrior language, right? That we want to be battle ready, we want to train for the fight, and I think a lot of times the culture listens to that language and they're like, this is the problem, this kind of militant, or, this kind of, let's face it, we're in a culture that's more and more passive, that is more and more so pluralistic and so relativistic that they think it's arrogant for anyone to think they've got bullets they can shoot. I mean, think about that, right? I mean, if you're making a case, like right now I get into a lot of dialogues about Black Lives Matter, and I know that I probably have to be very careful with my voice, with my approach, because they're looking at me to begin with as the white male police officer. And that is I've got to overcome that perception before we even begin, because just on the basis of my identity, and I think as Christians, we have a perception in the culture that we are kind of aggressive and arrogant and think everybody else is wrong. And so I want to be careful, right? When I look, many times when I'm in a trial, I actually like the guy that I'm prosecuting. Okay, because he's had 30 years to become a pretty decent guy. I one time took a guy to jail who was a fire captain. Okay, he had been a fire captain for I think 10 years. So this is a guy who had made something of his life. Now, I have to take him. He killed his wife, or in this case, he killed an employee. 30 years earlier. I have no choice. I like the guy. Yeah. I don't have anything out. I'm not after anybody. You just have to take the truth where it leads. And there are times when it's a bummer because you actually feel bad for the guy who's going to spend the rest of his life in jail. But 30 years ago he did kill his wife, so I'm sorry. You got to pay the price for that. But it's not because I have anything against him. It's just where the truth leads.
Yeah.
I don't have anything. I'm not either for or against Christianity. This is true. I'm not a Christian because it works for me, because it's comfortable, it's because it's socially acceptable. I'm a Christian because it's evidentially true. And so I've eliminated all the other junk, and I'm not against everybody else. I love everybody else. It's just that this view of the world actually represents the way the world really is. So what can I do about it? You live under it, because this is. Wouldn't you rather be in an inconvenient truth than in a convenient lie? Yeah. So I'm over here. And this is not the most convenient way to live, not in our culture. It's not going to. You're going to have to surrender your autonomy to something bigger than you. You're going to have to surrender your desires to something bigger than you. You're going to have to surrender your selfishness to something bigger than you. That's hard. Yeah. And but this is the way the world really is. So I'm willing to live in it.
Yeah. So yeah, we're becoming a little bit tight on time, but we got two more questions here, and man, it's been such a pleasure to have you on, Jim.
Amazing.
Grateful to be on, no problem.
Yeah. So this is a question from my friend George Gonzalez. He was a militant atheist. Now he's an agnostic, and one of the sort of something that he told me that really stood out. He was saying that a lot of the people I come across are theologians or intelligent Christians, and so he was supposed to come on the show and ask you a couple of questions, but he texted me and he's going to listen to later. So he has a question for you. He says, how does he reconcile science and Christianity?
Okay, so here's how I do it. The culture sometimes confuses these two things, not science and Christianity, but I mean the difference between facts and inferences. There is a difference between facts and the inferences we draw from facts. So in other words, if you get evidence at a crime scene, these are the facts. Now, I will use that evidence in trial, and then the defense attorney will come along, and he won't even introduce anything new. When it's his turn to present his case, he uses the exact same pieces of evidence that I already admitted, only he brings in experts to draw different inferences from the evidence. So the facts are just the pieces of evidence. Yeah. But the inferences we draw end up being for a number of reasons. If you're not fair, you can allow your desires to color your conclusions. You can allow your hopes and wishes, your own kind of wiring, to dictate how you infer from these pieces of evidence. But the point is, these are two different things. So what science does is it provides us with facts, okay? But the inference we draw from those facts is not a scientific inference. It's a philosophical inference from the evidence. So in other words, science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. Science are just the facts. The science gives us the facts, the data. Yeah. I can look at the data, the same data that some people will look at and say, I think from this data, I infer that evolution on the macro level occurs. Okay. I look at the same data, I see evidence of design, I infer something entirely differently. But we're looking at the exact same scientific facts, but drawing two completely different inferences from the facts. Yeah. Science is completely consistent with my theistic views because I'm actually looking at the scientific facts from cosmology, biology, neuroscience. So when I make arguments for how do we get a universe from nothing, why does it appear to be fine-tuned for the existence of life? Why do we have a life emerge from non-life? But why is it driven by information in DNA in the genome? Why is there the appearance of design that even Dawkins admits? Why do we use minds and not just brains? Yeah. Sam Harris denies, as a neuroscientist, he denies the mind, but he has to also deny free agency because he knows that the brain can't give you free agency. Yeah. How do we deal with moral facts and this standard of good by which we call anything evil? Here's my point. There are data points that we get from science, from cosmology, from biology, from neuroscience. But from those facts, those scientific facts, we're going to make an inference. I'm doing the same thing. I'm looking at the exact same science. I want to study those guys and what they're looking at as much as anybody else. Yeah. My inferences are different, though, and I can make a good philosophical argument for why I think my inferences are better. So the science is not in competition. I'm actually using the science as the foundation upon which I stand to make an inference. So when someone says the fact of evolution, it's a wrong word. There are facts from which you might infer that evolution is true. Maybe it is true. Okay, I don't think it is, but if you thought it was, fine. But it's not a fact; it's an inference. Yeah. The facts are the scientific data from which you inferred evolution was true. Yeah. Okay, fine, but don't confuse these two things. there are scientific facts, and then there are the inferences we make from those facts. As a Christian, I am able to look at the scientific facts and infer to God's existence.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, I think it's this caricature that the secular worldview paints on Christians and theism, that we're irrational, and it's like science versus religion, science versus Christianity, and that's just one of the most fallacious ways to view it.
Yeah, no, it is, and I think you're right. And so I think it's an argument in which, when people see that some of the best Christian thinkers and
Yes.
believers and theists are in fact the people like Michael Behe who are doing the science, it's helpful, because they'll see at least that he's able to make predictions, he's able to run experiments, he's able to yet he makes an entirely different set of inferences from the evidence, and he infers to intelligent design on the basis of what he's seeing in the science. So again, these are two different things. You don't have to turn off your brain to one. As a matter of fact, I would suggest we all become very facile with the scientific evidence.
Yeah. And he has the last question here is, can human beings be moral without a belief in God?
Of course.
Yes.
I should hope so.
Yes.
I consider myself to be a very moral person. Yeah. Now, again, whose standard am I using? I'm using my own. But let's just say, for example, you had two people who were both very, very exactly the same in their moral behavior, and one's a believer and one's not. The question is not whether or not you can be moral without believing in God. The question is, what are you grounding your moral claims in? Because you can accidentally, if you're going to read the book, you can't deny there's a book there, but you can always deny there was an author. The question is, how do we ground our claims about moral truth? And if you're going to say, you've only got a couple choices here. Morals either come from individuals, okay, in which case I can disagree with you, and you really could not say that I'm wrong, because if all moral truth comes from the individuals, then each individual is right. Now, we don't operate that way in our culture for a reason. So then we say, well, no, morals have to come from groups, and as a group or as a nation or as a clique or as a community, that we believe certain things are more, we set the standards, we form the laws. Well, if that's the case, then we can't disagree with other groups. And I guess the largest group who has the most people would have the greatest authority from moral truth, in which case we should all just do what the Chinese want us to do, because they're the biggest group. Clearly, after World War II, we believed that what the Germans were doing, although it was good to do and approved, and that people got promoted for doing it in their culture, that we were able to come alongside that culture afterwards and say, no, there's a law greater than the law. There's a law above the law. The question is, where does that come from? Now, Sam Harris would argue that it comes from our search. It's biological. That we have, it's the idea of human thriving, of human flourishing. This idea that we all have one thing in common, our humanity, our biological humanness. And in order to flourish, we find ourselves obeying a certain set of laws that increase our flourishing. That's a twist on words, though, because if he means survival, then there's lots of bad. As a matter of fact, all of us are having this conversation today because somewhere in our lineage, somebody did something horrific that eliminated a competitor so that you and I could be here to have this conversation. As a matter of fact, lots of bad behavior will help your genes survive into the next generation. What he's saying is, no, that flourishing is a noble kind of surviving. Well, wait a minute. Where do you get the word noble from? If you're saying that, you're borrowing again from a theistic worldview that has a definition of noble to say that certain kinds of survival are actually noble. So you can't even get it from biology. Now remember, all moral behaviors, all moral truth claims are obligations between people. I'm not morally obligated, neither is the person who's texting you, right? His name is George, right?
Yeah, George,
He's not. Yeah, George is not morally obligated to his phone, but he's morally obligated to the person he's texting to on the phone. We're not morally obligated to objects, to what's. We are morally obligated to whose. So if you're suggesting that all of the transcendent moral truths in the universe are somehow rooted back to physics, why do you feel any obligation at all? Physics is a what? It's not a who. If there is an objective, transcendent, obligation, it has to be to an objective, transcendent person. And that's the problem. So you might accidentally, I can be a Californian without knowing anything about California. Can a person who doesn't know anything about California or how it was founded actually call himself a Californian? Of course. And he can behave morally without having any idea where moral truths come from. And many of us do that our entire lives. That isn't the question. The question is, what is the best explanation for those behaviors that we have now adopted and call moral? Where do they come from? I suggest you try to make them come from every possible way you can think of. In the end, the best explanation is they are simply a reflection of the character and nature of our Creator.
Yeah. Yeah, and I might add that we're all created in the image of God, whether you believe in Him or not. And even in Romans, it talks about that the law, it's written on our hearts and on our conscience. And
right. Now, I can tell you that the reason why I didn't even bring up Romans 2,
yeah,
and I got a whole story about Romans 2, but I didn't bring it up because I know for me, as an atheist, that was not going to persuade me.
Right.
Because your book says I should know better? No, it doesn't get. But we just know. Now, again, what's great about Scripture is it reflects the world the way it really is. Right. So I can now show you Romans 2, and everything I've talked about philosophically matches everything that is written by Paul theologically.
Yeah.
So it turns out that he's writing about the world the way it really is.
Right. Yeah. So I would usually cut this to this last question, but I'm like, I really want you to answer this question, just because I know a lot of my friends, and I believe a lot of our friends here, for the people who are sitting at this table. You brought up evolution a couple of times, and that there is one of the biggest stumbling blocks for atheists and for even Christians. It was for me.
Sure. In
high school, I would always debate it in class. I came across in high school Dr. Ken Hovind, and he was the first apologist I ever saw, and I thought he was very, very interesting. I eventually ended up listening to Stephen Meyer and other great scientists. And I just want to get your opinion, and what would you say to a Christian and both an unbeliever on evolution, and is it true or not?
Okay, so the idea, of course, is that now look, I'm taking a kind of a standard approach that a lot of apologists take, but it's important, and that is that you have to understand what do we mean by the word evolution? Do we mean that change occurs over time based on environment? All of us as Christians believe that, because we believe we all came from Adam and Eve. And then there was another funnel point of the flood, so now we're the product of the sons of Noah. Yet, look how different we all look. Why do we look so different? Well, because we have been designed by God with enough variety in the genetic code to survive environments that are very, very different, very cold, very hot, very sparse, very lush. These differences are designed in the genome for a certain amount of flex in our physical appearance that helps our survival. But that is not evolution. That is a design feature that we recognize that comes all the way from Adam and Eve through the funnel point of the flood, and here we have all of these different races of humans. We're all human, though. Now, why does that happen? Because we as Christians believe that we have enough change over time can occur. It's not going to go from species to species, though. This is microevolution. It's subtle changes, and when the pressure is taken off, guess what happens? You return like the finches on the Galapagos Islands. The beak length returns to its design feature. It can flex given an environment, but when all the environmental pressures are removed, it goes back to its original form. That is a very different proposition than the macroevolution that is suggested, basically molecule to man. Now, we don't believe, as Christians, I don't believe that God uses evolution to design. I don't believe that, because the whole paradigm of evolution is random mutation acted upon by the environmental pressures of natural selection. So if there's something random that's at the foundation, I don't think God's involved in that. God is not a God of random disharmony. God is a God of order, and He's a designer. So I don't think this idea that you can have a theistic evolution is like a contradiction in terms. It's like you're saying theistic means it's ordered intentionally, it is designed. So you're saying you have something that's ordered and designed, yet at the same time is random. Now, I think even if you could control all of the forces and factors involved, you're still counting on the random mutation acted upon by environment. To me, this is a very poor analogy of what God does in a creative act. So I don't think we can embrace theistic evolution either. Now, look, lots of evolutionists now are trying to figure out how do they overcome the problems with the model they've embraced so far. I'm not the only person who's drawing this out. There are lots of people who deny God and deny that God has any root, but they still know there are huge gaps in the theory. That they're trying to argue with punctuated evolution. How do we? Apparently the change is taking place much faster than they want it to. We've got the appearance of every species you can imagine in the Cambrian explosion. I mean, it's too much is happening too fast. And so how do we get the kind of change that they would suggest occurs from molecule to man? I think that's now, how does God create? That's really the question.
Yeah.
Is God creating full form? Is God a progressive creationist? I mean, there's lots of arguments within the boundaries of Orthodox Christianity in which people disagree about how God acts as a creator. I get that. I'm not going to divide from my brothers who embrace the Orthodox positions, but they still have questions about exactly how God is creating.
Yeah.
Well, I've had lots of friends, for example, who I've worked with on criminal cases, where 4 of us on the homicide team, we know we have the right guy, but we all wonder how he did it. And if he confesses, we'll find out if any of us are right. But a lot of times these guys don't confess. So without knowing precisely how he did it, we are convinced enough by the evidence that he did it to be able to prosecute him in front of a jury.
Yeah.
We're never going to find out exactly how he did it, though, unless he confesses. Well, it turns out here, I don't know exactly how God achieves this, but there's more than enough evidence to infer that he did it.
Yeah.
So how he did it precisely is something you'll get, because he'll eventually tell us.
Yeah.
But we're not going to get that on this side of the grave.
Yeah. I was talking to apologist Matt Slick. You know who he is? Matt
Yep,
Matt
absolutely.
Slick. Yeah, and I was talking to him, and I've always said this. I was like, in the next 15 to 20 years, I feel like, I mean, it already is, though, just the neo-Darwinianism, sort of the mechanism of evolution, it's collapsing before our eyes. And I was listening to Stephen Meyer, and he was talking about that there's a new atheism that's coming out, and you could look them up. They're called the Third Way. And they're completely saying, okay, this whole orthodox neo-Darwinian mechanism, natural selection and stuff, it's got holes, and we got to move away from it. And you see it at the Royal Society as well. If you listen to Frank Turk's podcast, I mean, it's incredible to see that they are starting to come to grips with there's a lot of failure in this theory.
Well, and you know this from the atheist Thomas Nagel, who you just quoted a little while ago. He's one of those folks who says, look, whatever this theory is, he hopes that there's an atheistic theory that will work, because he wants there to be no God. I get that.
Yeah.
But you see what he's saying is there's a problem. Whatever our theories we have so far are deficient. They don't get the job done. They don't account for certain aspects of reality that none of us can deny.
Yeah.
And so he's arguing that we've got to do better than this in the theory. And I think that they're right. Now, in the end, it's a cumulative case. I think you're going to see that the theory has to account for lots of the origin of life. Believe it or not, as much as they want to deny it, is part of the evolutionary process. Yes, we're talking about biological evolution, but the chemical evolution that gets you to biology is part of the continuum, right? I mean, you can't just say the game begins on the 10-yard line going into the goal. The game begins at kickoff.
Yeah.
Okay, and so this game begins at kickoff. And so we got to figure out, if you can't answer that question, and if the best evidence we have so far is that all of life is not grounded in physics, all of life is grounded in information. That's a game changer. It was a game changer that changed Antony Flou's opinion as the most critically renowned atheist of the last century. Now, he didn't die a Christian, but he died a theist because or at least a deist, because he did not believe we could account that evolution could ever account for the appearance of design both in the universe and in biology. So I think it's important for us to at least be honest about this. I think the honest position, I think, for anyone would be at least deism.
Yeah.
Now, you can make claims about, to push back, but if you're going to be honest about this and reasonable, when people say they even reject any form of deism, I realize that there's some issues there that are beyond what they're saying, because that's at least a default position that would be reasonable.
Yeah.
And I think there are people who are kind of quietly deists, that are out there, that are doing work kind of under the cover of agnosticism. They really, in their hearts, are some form of Paul Davies, for example, at Arizona State University. He would identify himself as an agnostic, but I think as I'm reading his writing, I'm thinking if he's reasonable at all, he at least has to believe that there's something bigger than he might not be able to say he can land it, but it's clear that he realizes the science demonstrates to him that there's no way to explain that without intelligence.
Yeah.
You could be like Elon Musk, who believes in a simulation.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think that's part of this. Is you end up with all. Here's what I always say: science is very willing to ask 5 of the 6 most important questions. They're willing to ask what, when, why, how, and where. But that's not all the questions you have to ask in any investigation. I can get those questions, what, why, how, when, where, about a crime, and no one's ever going to go to jail. No one goes to jail until I'm willing to ask the who question. Science refuses to ask a who question because it doesn't believe there are any who's. All there are whats, impersonal forces. There are no personal forces.
Exactly.
But it turns out on every investigation you're willing to ask about any topic, you're always going to ask all 6 questions. But here, you refuse to ask the 6th question. And that leads you to all kinds of crazy answers, because it would be a lot easier if you would just ask a who question, because you get an answer quickly and go, okay, I got it. But no, they refuse to ask the who question, so now the theories they have are remarkable. Yeah. And it's all because they refuse to ask a who question.
Yeah. Well, we're here with Jim Warner Wallace, author and cold case detective. Man, it's been absolutely so much fun to talk to you, man. We're going to go ahead and end it here.
Okay, sounds good. And just let me know, and I'll be happy to return anytime to talk more.
Yes.
Oh,
please.
yes. Oh, yeah. We're definitely going to have you on. Again, for our listeners and for the community of Laredo, we sell his books here, Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, and also his new one, Forensic Faith. Jim, if you want to add any plugins, where can they find you at? Your website as well?
Yeah, you can visit me at coldcasechristianity.com. It's kind of the first book became kind of the name of our ministry, and now we're branching off into kids' versions of these books. And I think that's been probably, if I'm honest with you, the most fun we've had for 2 reasons. One, my wife is actively involved in that process of producing those books, and she's got great input. You know, being a mom, she kind of sees things that I don't see, and maybe ways to approach kids that I haven't thought about approaching. So, and also, when you take these more difficult concepts and you're forced to get them, we have a high bar for our kids, but we know we have to, make them age appropriate. And when each book is actually a mystery that is unwrapped, that has nothing to do with the claims of theism or Christianity. We just want to give the kids a mystery to unwrap, along with the mystery of Christianity and God's crime scene. And as we do that, it's been so much fun to see kids embrace the books. There's nothing more satisfying than having a kid send a picture to you, holding your book. It was completed the academy. We have an online academy.
That's awesome, man.
And they've got a certificate they're holding, and you're thinking to yourself, really?
Yeah.
This is where God can do amazing things. So, anyway, it's been fun to do that. So, coldcasechristianity.com.
Yeah. Again, Jim, thank you so much. For our listeners, subscribe to our podcast, Coffee Colloquy, or actually look us up, Bridge Ministry on iTunes, SoundCloud. Look us up on YouTube, and this podcast will be up there. And just be ready for the next one when Jim Warner Wallace comes on. We would definitely love to have you come back and talk about God's crime scene.
Be happy to do it.
Okay.
Be happy to do it. Okay, bud.
Thanks, guys.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
See ya.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right. Well, that wraps up this podcast. Today was an excellent one. And be sure to share with your friends and family. Spread it around. Again, you could come by Bridge Ministries and pick up your copy of Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, or Forensic Faith. Jim Warner Wallace is the author of all of those, and you could get so much more detail than what you got in this podcast. There was just a little taste of what is in those books. So keep your eyes out for the next podcast. JP Holding is going to be coming on with us July 21st. I'm so excited. He's going to be talking about his book, Shattering the Jesus Myth, and we're going to try to live stream that one. This podcast, be ready for this one. This one's going to be a fun one, to say the least. But anyway, we are going to go ahead and take off. Love your neighbor as you love yourself, and spread the gospel, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.